China's ambitions to seize Taiwan are no secret, but President Xi Jinping's plans go far beyond reunification. His real goal? Global domination. Taking Taiwan will be just the beginning, a crucial step towards building a Chinese world empire. Today, we're investigating why this small island holds the key to the launch of China's major plans for global domination, and why we should all be concerned if Xi and the Chinese Communist Party get their way. I'm Simon Diggins, and this is Superpowers Exposed, a weekly series where we delve into the world's biggest players as they compete for global power. Before we get started, please remember to subscribe to this channel. Taiwan is located in the first island chain and is in many respects the pivot in that chain. To its north is the Yellow Sea, and to its south is the South China Sea. As it currently sits, it could be used as a point of control, stopping China being able to expand beyond the first island chain. However, in Chinese hands, it then gives them direct access to the Western Pacific. But China's ambition to take Taiwan is part of a much wider pattern, building naval and military bases across Pacific and Indian Oceans to dominate trade routes and to control access to raw resources. It's worth saying that China last had a true ocean-going navy in 1492, which of course is the same year that Columbus reached America. China sailed into the Indian Ocean, but started to withdraw just as Europe began to expand. As it's looked to expand though, China has been studying the British Empire to see how it gained global power through trade, through securing ports, then securing its trade routes, establishing lodgements or bases, and then interfering in local governments, outposts, and eventually, of course, establishing colonies itself. The lesson they've taken away is control the trade choke points and then you control the world. Beijing is following the same basic pattern. Trade routes, bases, influence in the countries it's trading with, and ultimately control. Some, I think, call it a new form of Chinese colonialism. And if we're looking for examples where China are expanding, just look at this map. In the Pacific, we've got the South China Sea, where they've established a series of military islands, and then there was the Solomon Islands deal, which caused such a ruckus with Australia. Look into the Indian Ocean, they've established relationships with Mauritius, and in Djibouti, they've got their first ever overseas foreign port. But they're also to be found in Tajikistan, Cambodia, and Argentina as bases. And then linked to that, we have another slightly more subtle use. They're establishing a series of dual-use commercial and naval ports in places like Pakistan, Equatorial Guinea, and the United Arab Emirates. We've also seen a much more bold and decisive use of their navies. We've seen them deploying 2 aircraft carriers with their associated escorts beyond the first island chain. This is a significant deployment. Bear in mind, we've just put round 1 aircraft carrier into the Pacific. This is 2 aircraft carriers with all of their support vessels and aircraft embarked itself. Very few countries in the world could do that, but the Chinese are now capable of doing that. In February of this year, China's navy sailed all the way around Australia, catching, it has to be said, the Australian government by surprise. China is now able to operate further from home for longer periods with greater capability. This is a major and significant development. It just shows how much China's navy has grown and how far it can now operate from home. So along with all this military development, we've also got a significant commercial development, what the Chinese call the Belt and Road Initiative, a reconstruction of the Golden Road to China that existed in the Middle Ages. What they have is a global strategy to build trade routes and spread influence through infrastructure and commercial engagement. This buys them influence and friends. China will dominate the world, not just through armies or navies, but through dominating trade networks itself. But this also creates dependence, particularly on the countries they're working with. They need China for the future. But all this development, all starts with Taiwan. President Xi has given orders to his armed forces that they are to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027. We've seen a whole series of regular exercises, including completely surrounding Taiwan. Recent satellite imagery has shown a mock-up of the Taiwanese capital, which Chinese forces then practice conducting coup de main assaults onto. It's clearly a serious and growing threat. Any conflict would almost certainly disrupt any global supply chains, including and especially the microchips from Taiwan. Taiwan's military is much smaller and uses older equipment, but it's well aware of the threat and is working to strengthen its defences to try and turn the island into a, for want of a better term, a porcupine to attack. The fight, if it were to occur, would centre aircraft, ships, missiles and cyber, not necessarily on tanks or artillery. The real challenge, though, is that time is not on Taiwan's side. The question is whether they can be ready before 2027. So what would that fight actually look like, and how did Taiwan's forces compare to China's? China's forces outnumber and have significantly more firepower than Taiwan. Without US or Allied support, the outcome would be very one-sided. This scorecard gives you some idea of the relative strengths between Taiwan and China. The thing to look at to begin with is probably their aircraft carrier and their fleet strength, and you can see here that China clearly has the fleet requirements to take an island which sits 100 miles off the Chinese coast. But if you also look at their ability then to project force through use of fighter aircraft and rocket launch, again you see the significant disparity between the two countries. But biggest of all is the actual numbers. The active personnel of China, over 2 million, versus Taiwan's 215,000. And numbers aren't everything, but they give you a sense of the ability of a country not just to fight, but to sustain that fight. And clearly for China, that's what they're going to need. To understand Beijing's obsession with Taiwan, we need to look back at the century of humiliation, the painful defeats that still fuel China's ambitions today. Now, China often calls itself the Middle Kingdom. This began as a geographical expression, being the middle powers of what we now call China itself. But later it became representative of its view of the world. They were the centre of the world and all other powers were suppliant to it. We are dealing here with a 4,000-year-old civilization, and that's very key to, I think, understanding China today. It's prepared to think in decades or even centuries. Key to understanding China's attitude is what it calls the century of humiliation. This started in the mid-19th century with the First Opium War, when Britain forced China to open its ports and hand over Hong Kong. The Second Opium War, which started some 20-odd years later, Western powers deepened their control, exploiting Chinese economy and treating it as an inferior state. This directly contradicted their view of themselves as the Middle Kingdom. The result was a series of unequal treaties that weakened Chinese sovereignty and opened even more ports and its trade to foreign influence and control. This humiliation was also associated with seizure of territory. Hong Kong we've talked about, but the Portuguese took Macau. This had a reaction. There was a rebellion at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, which was put down by a combination of foreign powers, including, and the Japanese had got in on the conquest, the Japanese themselves. They had started in 1895 and took vast areas of northern China. This Japanese occupation continued right through to the end of the Second World War. The Japanese were thrown out at the end of that Civil War. There was then a brutal civil war between the communist Chinese and the official government at the time, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Chairman Mao attempted to turn China into a model version of a socialist state, but this started to collapse and fail in the 60s and 70s. His successors decided to do something else. They wanted a state-directed capitalist society, but still with a strong central control and a firm control by the Chinese Communist Party. They looked to evolve a society which was capitalist, but with the authoritarian control of the Chinese Communist Party being maintained. That never again mentality, which has been born from a century of humiliation, still drives China today. And that's exactly why Taiwan matters so much. It represents the last remaining link, the final reminder of the humiliation that China vowed to erase. But here's the real question. Is Taiwan the end goal or the opening act of a new world order led by Beijing? Taiwan was part of China from the 17th century until 1895, when it was handed over to the Japanese as part of the end of the Sino-Japanese War. Come 1949, under the split, Chiang Kai-shek, the Republic of China's forces, retreat to Taiwan was not so they could establish a new nation. It was meant as a base to retake the mainland itself. And both sides, both Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, saw one China and not two. For Beijing, taking Taiwan isn't expansion, it's unfinished business. It's the final step in China's national transformation and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But in many aspects, they're running out of time. At a personal level, President Xi is now 72. Not a great age in and of itself, but clearly there's a sort of time-limited element to him. And then the bigger picture, the really big picture, China's population is set to shrink by over half by 2100. So their ability to effect major strategic change is limited and must take place for them over the next 10, 15, 20 or 30 years. They cannot wait until the end of the century. We should also recognise that the Chinese Communist Party uses its national aspirations over Taiwan to shore up its internal unity and to validate its authoritarian model against Taiwan's democracy. It shows that the model of state-directed capitalism without democracy can work, and that's important to them internally itself. So taking Taiwan isn't just territorial, it's symbolic, it's political, and it's also deeply personal. But there's another reason China wants Taiwan, and it's worth trillions. The world runs on semiconductors, and through this company TSMC, Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced chips. They're crucial for cutting-edge smartphones, data centers, and artificial intelligence hardware. TSMC is the world's 9th most valuable company, with a market capitalization of $1,534 trillion US, and those are October figures. Gaining Taiwan would mean instant control of the planet's most valuable manufacturing technology. Beijing could use this to pressure or influence other nations economically. This is what we call Taiwan's silicon shield. Losing Taiwan's chip output would wipe trillions of global GDP, crippling supply chains. So the silicon shield is both Taiwan's greatest strength and its biggest vulnerability. China's goal in taking Taiwan will be to secure this capacity and dominate this high-tech sector which defines global and military power. This fits with their control of other rare minerals and resources and their willingness to take strategic positions. For example, when I was in Afghanistan in 2008, the Chinese took a position on a copper mine, probably potentially the largest in the world, but they couldn't exploit it at that point because it was under the control of the Taliban. But nonetheless, they were willing to pay for a 50-year option on that particular mine. This is their approach. China looks to use its economic power there in two main ways. Firstly, as we've seen in this country very recently, it makes other nations very hesitant to call China enemy. But then also, by controlling global trade and semiconductors, Beijing gains huge leverage. That dependence makes it much harder for any power to oppose a move on Taiwan. If China really is building the foundations of a new world empire, it's creating what could be the biggest World War III flashpoint of our time. Because the other great superpower of our time, the United States, is not just going to sit by and watch. Since 2014, the US has shifted its focus to the Pacific, deeply concerned about China and Taiwan. The United States has no official stance on Taiwan's status, but does oppose any forceful takeover. The US supplies Taiwan with weapons, but direct military support remains uncertain. However, we've seen a deployment of US special forces to Kinmen, a tiny island directly off the Chinese coast. This is an historic shift in their defence posture. As you can see from the map, Kinmen is directly adjacent to the Chinese coast and therefore has clear strategic importance. If China controlled the Pacific, that would mean the end of US dominance in the region. Washington sees the Pacific as vital for free trade and open movement of goods and people. And that's why it strongly opposes the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. China would then have the upper hand in the Western Pacific. And of course, if the US were drawn into a conflict over Taiwan, the UK itself may also be drawn in. Whilst Britain has been focused in recent years on Ukraine, the purpose of our two aircraft carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth, HMS Prince of Wales, was to project Britain as a global power, which of course basically means the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And we've just seen this year a UK carrier group deployment to the Pacific in support of that particular vision. While Taiwan is the most likely flashpoint, it's not the only one. There are other places where a single mistake could spark a wider conflict. In the Philippines, in the South China Sea, we've seen aggressive confrontation by Chinese forces of Philippine ships, and we've also seen the construction there of defence islands by the Chinese themselves. And the Philippines, of course, is a close US ally, and to support the Philippines, the US has been deploying anti-ship missiles, Typhoons, into the Philippines itself. If China went too far and a clash happened, the US, bound by its defence treaty of the Philippines, could be pulled in. And then we've got North Korea, little rocket man himself. North Korea often acts aggressively and causes tension in the region. And while it's fair to say, I think the Chinese find the behaviour of North Korea embarrassing, North Korea is still technically its ally. If a conflict broke out involving North Korea and the US, or North Korea and South Korea, China would feel pressure to defend it. And that could drag both China and the US into a direct confrontation. But North Korea isn't China's only ally. Recently, commentators have talked about the axis of upheaval, the links between Russia and North Korea, all powers that want to change what's been deemed the international order which has existed since the end of the Second World War. China and Russia have established what they call a no-limits friendship. And China has been a key supporter of Russia since the 2020 invasion of Ukraine, buying its oil and the gas cut off from Western markets itself. And recently, they've just signed a deal to establish a new Trans-Siberian pipeline to bring Russian oil and gas to China itself. We've also seen use of Chinese ships in the so-called shadow fleet, which have been helping to move sanctioned Russian fuel. They have also been linked to sabotage operations, for example, the operation in the Gulf of Finland, where the cables between Finland and Estonia were cut. Joint military exercises between China and Russia are now routine. And then lastly, there's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, primarily focused on commerce, but it could easily evolve into a military alliance. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, warned that President Xi could use the junior partner, Putin and Russia, to distract the West with a move on Europe while he invades Taiwan. China's main rivals remain, of course, South Korea, Japan, the US and the wider West. But the West is very dependent on China economically. And the real issue is, will the West actually confront China or keep doing business as usual? Now in this series, we're going to look at what each country's wildcard is, a unique advantage that shapes its power. For China, it's not just the growing military might, it's the power of influence and commerce. Through trade, technology and global supply chains, Beijing could win the power game without firing a single shot. In so doing, President Xi is following the dictum of the famous Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, who said, in war, the supreme excellence is to win without fighting. President Xi is a man in a hurry. He's determined to take Taiwan and cement China's place as the dominant power of the 21st century. And China's demographic window of opportunity is closing fast. By 2100, the country's population could have sunk by a half. Taiwan may be the first target, but it's only a glimpse into a much bigger plan, one that could redefine who holds power in the 21st century. And as China moves closer to that goal, the world will have to decide how or if it can stop it. Now, you may agree with me, disagree with me, or have your own theory. Please do tell us in the comments, and don't forget to vote in our poll.